The night sky over Ukraine was a deep, endless black. It was 1941, and the distant hum of German bombers filled the air. In a small farming village, a teenage girl named Nadezhda Popova stood outside, looking up. She was only 19, but her eyes already carried the weight of a country under fire. The Nazis had invaded the Soviet Union. Cities were burning, and her own home had been turned into a war zone. Yet, instead of fear, she felt something else: defiance. Popova wasn't supposed to fly. Back then, women were expected to heal the wounded, not join the fight. But she refused to stay grounded. She had first flown in a rickety training plane years earlier, and that moment, the wind on her face, the freedom in her chest, had changed her forever. Flying wasn't just an interest anymore, it was an obsession. When she heard about a new, all-female Soviet regiment, one that would bomb German positions at night, she didn't hesitate for a second. She packed what little she had, said goodbye to her family, and left for training. Her mother wept. Her father tried to stop her. But Nadezhda only said, "If the men can fight for our land, why can't we?" By the time she reached the training camp, hundreds of young women just like her had arrived. Students, teachers, factory workers. None of them had any real military experience, but they had something else: courage. They would soon become known by a name whispered in fear by German soldiers: Nachthexen, or the Night Witches. And among them, Popova would become one of the most daring pilots of them all.
The training grounds were nothing like the heroic posters promised. The young women arrived expecting real planes and proper instructors. Instead, they found freezing barracks, broken equipment, and old biplanes that looked like they belonged in a museum. The aircraft they were given, the Polikarpov P-02, was a wooden, fabric-covered crop duster from the 1920s. No armor, no radio, no parachute. The girls laughed at first, thinking it must be a mistake, but it wasn't. These flimsy little machines would soon become their weapons. Each morning began before dawn. They learned to assemble and repair engines with frostbitten fingers, to navigate by stars instead of instruments, and to fly low enough to avoid German radar, sometimes barely 100 meters above the ground. If the enemy opened fire, they were told to cut their engines, glide silently, drop their bombs, and slip away into the dark. It was a deadly game of stealth and nerves. Nadezhda Popova stood out from the start. She wasn't just brave, she was precise. She treated the Polikarpov P-02 not as a relic, but as a living creature that demanded respect. She memorized its quirks: how it vibrated when pushed too hard, how it drifted with crosswinds, how every tiny movement of her hands could mean the difference between landing and crashing. At night, they practiced bombing runs on empty fields, the instructors watching silently from the ground. The girls learned to fly by instinct, trusting the darkness instead of their eyes. Some crashed, others froze in fear and never returned. But those who remained were transformed. They weren't farm girls anymore. They were warriors, forged from exhaustion, hunger, and grit. And as the German front drew closer, word spread across the Soviet bases. A squadron of women was coming, silent, fearless, and ready to fight back. The Night Witches were about to take to the sky for real. It was a moonless night in June 1942 when the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, later known as the Night Witches, took off for their first real mission. The air was still and cold. The only sounds were the rattle of engines and the creak of wooden frames. Nadezhda Popova's hands trembled slightly as she tightened her leather helmet. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of failing. The Germans had already torn through villages, leaving fire and screams in their wake. Tonight was their first chance to strike back. Their target? A heavily guarded ammunition depot near the Don River. The women flew in pairs, one plane distracting anti-aircraft guns, the other gliding in silently for the bombing run. The poor twos lifted off the frozen strip one by one, their small engines growling like angry insects. Once airborne, they climbed into the void of the night. There were no radios, no navigation lights, just the stars above and the black earth below. Halfway to the target, searchlights cut through the darkness like blades. Flak shells exploded around them, the night sky flashing white and orange. Popova's co-pilot shouted something, but the wind swallowed her words. Nadezhda killed the engine. Silence. The plane instantly turned ghost-like, gliding through the air as if suspended by fate itself. The Germans below heard nothing but the whisper of wings. They reached the depot, dropped 2 small bombs, and a moment later the ground erupted in fire. Popova reignited the engine and banked hard to escape, the shock wave from the explosion pushing the fragile Po-2 upward. Behind her, the sky glowed red, proof that they'd hit the target. When the squadron returned to base, the women burst into tears and laughter. They had done it. Against all odds, they had struck fear into an enemy that believed women couldn't fight. That night, the legend of the Night Witches was born.
By late 1942, the Germans had given these women a new name, Nachthexen, the Night Witches. At first, the soldiers laughed at the idea of women pilots, but soon laughter turned to terror. They said the sound of the wooden Po-2s gliding through the night, engines cut, wings slicing air, reminded them of broomsticks flying overhead. When that faint rustle came, the soldiers would dive for cover, whispering, "The witches are here." Each night, Nadezhda Popova and her squadron took to the air in planes that looked more like toys than weapons. Fabric stretched over wood, open cockpits and no parachutes. If hit, they had no chance. The cold bit their faces and frost covered their goggles. They carried 2 bombs at a time, one under each wing, forcing them to make multiple trips, up to 8 or 10 missions in a single night. They would climb, cut the engines, glide in dead silence, drop their bombs, then reignite the engine and disappear back into the dark. The Germans were helpless. Radar couldn't detect the Po-2s, and their speed was so slow that enemy fighters often stalled trying to chase them. Every night, the skies of the Eastern Front came alive with this haunting ballet, the whisper of death gliding above sleeping camps. By dawn, the women returned to their base exhausted, covered in oil, faces blackened with soot, laughing, hugging, alive. To the world, they were just girls. To the Germans, they were a nightmare. And to each other, they were sisters in the sky, bound not by glory, but by fire, fear, and unbreakable courage.
Winter, 1943. The Battle of Stalingrad, the bloodiest conflict in human history. The sky glowed orange from constant shelling, the city below reduced to ruins and ashes. Smoke blanketed everything. Amid this chaos, the Night Witches received their deadliest orders yet. Fly into the inferno, bomb enemy supply lines, and don't get caught. Nadezhda Popova adjusted her fur-lined helmet, her breath freezing in the open cockpit. Beneath her, the Volga River shimmered faintly under the moonlight. Her co-pilot, Yevdokia Bershanskaya, gripped the map, shaking not from fear, but from the -30°C wind cutting through their thin uniforms. They flew low, dangerously low, just above treetops and factory chimneys. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from the ground like volcanoes, black clouds bursting around them. Tracer rounds sliced through the night, one missing her wing by inches. Popova stayed calm. She dipped the nose, killed the engine, and glided silently over enemy lines. The world went still. only the sound of her heartbeat. Then, boom! A direct hit. The supply depot below exploded, sending flames hundreds of feet high. The shockwave lifted her fragile PO2, tossing it like paper in a storm. She wrestled the controls, engine roaring back to life, barely keeping the plane steady. Behind her, the horizon burned. The mission was a success, but one of their planes did not return. Popova's eyes filled with tears as she landed back at base. Another sister gone, another empty bunk in the barracks. But there was no time to grieve. Command wanted them up again before sunrise. That night, as she looked up at the sky filled with smoke and stars, she whispered, "We will keep flying for them." The witches would rise again, silent, fearless, unstoppable.
By 1944, whispers of the night witches had spread far beyond the Eastern Front. German soldiers, once fearless, now dreaded the faint whoosh of fabric wings slicing through the dark. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was an omen. Men in trenches would look up, terrified, muttering, "The witches are here." They flew the Polikarpov Po-2, a slow, outdated biplane made of plywood and canvas, but that's what made them so deadly. Enemy radars couldn't detect them. Searchlights often missed them. The Luftwaffe pilots, flying modern Messerschmitts, called them phantoms. Even the Germans put a bounty on their heads, the Iron Cross for any pilot who could shoot one down. But catching them was almost impossible. The Po-2 was too agile, too low, too unpredictable. Every trick the Luftwaffe tried failed. Back at camp, Nadezhda Popova, one of the squadron's fiercest flyers, listened to the rumors with a small, defiant grin. "Witches," she whispered. Maybe they were right, because only witches could survive what they had. Freezing nights, burning skies, no radios, no parachutes, no armor, just courage. By now, the night witches had flown over 23,000 missions, dropping more than 3,000 tons of bombs. Their planes might have been fragile, but their spirit was unbreakable. They weren't fighting just for their country anymore. They were fighting for every woman who had ever been told, "You can't." As dawn broke and frost covered the grass, Popova gathered her team beside their battered planes. "They think we're witches," she said, tightening her flight cap. "Then let's give them another nightmare." Engines coughed to life. One by one, the night witches rose into the sky, shadows carrying vengeance, courage, and history.
The winter of 1945 was cruel, the kind that froze oil in the engines and turned breath into ice. But the night witches didn't stop. They never did. The war was nearing an end, yet the missions only grew more dangerous. The Germans, desperate and furious, now filled the skies with spotlights and flak cannons, waiting for those silent shadows to appear. That night, Nadezhda Popova and her navigator, Yekaterina Ryabova, prepared for one last bombing run near Poland. Their plane, an old Po-2 patched with cloth and wire, looked like it had survived 100 deaths already. Nadezhda ran her gloved fingers over the wooden wings. "One more," she whispered. They took off into a starless sky. The world below was nothing but black smoke and distant fire. Once they reached enemy lines, Nadezhda killed the engine. The plane glided soundlessly, just the wind brushing past. This was their signature move, the thing that made the Germans believe in witches. Then suddenly, light. Searchlights pierced the dark, sweeping the sky like giant claws. Flak shells exploded around them, shaking the fragile biplane. A fragment ripped through the wing, but Nadezhda held steady. "Hold on, Katya," she shouted. They dropped their bombs right on target, a fuel depot, and the ground erupted in flames. She reignited the engine, banking hard through smoke and gunfire. Somehow they made it out.
The moment they crossed friendly lines, their PO2 sputtered and groaned, almost collapsing mid-air, but it held on, like they always did. When they landed, the other women ran to them, cheering, crying. The final mission of the Night Witches was complete. And as dawn crept over the eastern horizon, the world's most feared witches, exhausted, frozen, victorious, watched the sky they had conquered with nothing but courage and wood. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the Night Witches returned home as legends, though many never made it back. Over 23,000 missions, more than 3,000 tons of bombs dropped, and countless nights spent staring death in the face. They had fought not for fame, but for survival, for their country, their comrades, and for a world that never believed women could fly, let alone fight. Yet when peace returned, the glory didn't. Many of them were told to go back to being women again. Their achievements were buried beneath medals handed to men. Some couldn't even find jobs as pilots after the war. Nadezhda Popova later said, "After all we'd done, the war gave us wings, and peace took them away." Still, their story refused to fade. The Germans had feared them, calling them Nachthäschen, night witches, because of the eerie sound of their gliding planes, the whispering wooden wings that haunted the skies. And decades later, the world would learn what those witches had truly been: heroes. Popova, Ryabova, and many of their sisters lived long enough to see their legend grow. They stood before young cadets and told stories not of killing, but of courage, of nights so dark you couldn't see your own hands, of laughter between missions, of fear and friendship, and that feeling, the one that came just before the engine shut off, when the plane fell silent, and the only thing you could hear was your heart. The Night Witches had rewritten history. They turned fragile fabric and wood into symbols of defiance, and in the quiet of the post-war years, the sound of their wings still seemed to echo, a reminder that even in the darkest nights, bravery can take flight.
The war had ended, but the stories of the Night Witches would live forever. Nadezhda Popova, Yekaterina Ryabova, and the countless other women who had risked their lives in the fragile Po-2 biplanes left behind a legacy that would inspire generations. They had flown through freezing nights, dodged enemy fire, and carried out missions that seemed impossible, all with nothing but courage, skill, and determination. Their planes were simple, almost fragile, but they carried something far heavier: the weight of hope, the defiance of oppression, and the will to fight for something bigger than themselves. Each mission wasn't just a bombing run. It was a statement, a declaration that bravery knows no gender, that ingenuity can defy even the deadliest threats, and that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary feats. Even today, decades later, the story of the Night Witches resonates. Military historians study their tactics, pilots cite their fearlessness, and everyday people, inspired by their courage, see in them a lesson about perseverance, teamwork, and the human spirit. As we reflect on their story, one cannot help but feel the wind on those wooden wings, the cold bite of the Eastern Front, and the silent glide over enemy lines. It was a flight that changed history, a flight that carried more than bombs. It carried the idea that no wall, no rule, and no expectation can ground true courage. And though many of the women have passed, their legend remains. In the skies they once haunted, in the history books, and in every story of bravery that refuses to fade. The Night Witches proved that even in the darkest nights, with only wood, fabric, and hope, humanity could soar.